Hello, everyone. This is Michelle Brickley, Associate Director at OVW. Thank you all so much for taking time out to be on today's call. I know for the folks that we may have probably fewer folks because we're having this wonderful snowstorm south and east. I'm all snowed in, but I'm on the call. So we have a lot of information to get through today. Marnie will be presenting the information on both the PREA FAQs and the regular STOP FAQs. I'm going to ask, just so that we can have some continuity in the call, I'm going to ask that if you have questions, if you can email them to me, and my email address is Michelle, Michelle, .Brickley, B as in boy, RICKLEY, @usdoj.gov. And we will answer questions periodically throughout the call, but we will also we'll probably have to save some questions to the end of the call. But we want to make sure we allow enough time to get through all the material that Marnie has for us today. So that's all I have. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Marnie.
Thanks, Michelle. As Michelle said, I have a lot of material to cover. I'm going to go through the PREA FAQs and the STOP 2013 FAQs. I'm going to try to do more of a highlights reel and not hit every single FAQ. Some of them have not changed that much, but the ones that have changed significantly or that are new in some way, I will try to discuss somewhat, and then hopefully we'll still have time for questions. I'm going to start with the PREA stuff because I know it's something you guys have been asking for a while, and we do appreciate your patience in waiting until we finally had something we are allowed to put out there for you. So the PREA is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and it has a penalty provision that affects 5% of covered funds for states that are not in compliance with the PREA regulations issued by the Department of Justice. And 5% of covered funds for STOP comes out to 4.75% actually of the full STOP award, because the penalty or reallocation, I'll explain what those two terms mean in a second, is assessed on everything but the court money. So it's 5% of 95 rather than 5% of the whole award. And the reason for that is that there's nothing you could do with court money that would bring you into compliance with PREA. But for all the other allocations, there's something that you could do that would bring you into compliance. And so those allocations are covered. The reason why the STOP program is a covered program under the PREA is because the PREA requires this reallocation or penalty on programs with, quote, prison purposes. And in determining that, we look at the purpose areas, and the STOP program now has a purpose area about developing, enlarging, or strengthening programs addressing sexual assault against men, women, and youth in correctional and detention settings. It's purpose area 17, and that's a prison purpose. And that's why we have this issue with the STOP program. The department sent a letter to all the governors, and you all were supposed to be copied on it, so hopefully you got it, which explained the process and had two different forms attached to it, a certification form and an assurance form. So the idea is there's three different options of what could happen depending on your status in your state with PREA compliance. So option one is I'm fully compliant, or my state is fully compliant. In that case, you're done. Nothing further happens. You'll sign the certification. The only thing to note is that part of the certification process is that you agree if the state finds out they're not compliant, because the part of the regulations is there's an audit process, and the audit cycle is a 3-year cycle, so a third the first year, a third the second year, a third the third year, and then back to the first set. So you may think you're compliant, and then you start getting audits in that show, well, okay, actually there were some problems. And if that happens, then you have to notify the department, and you might have to, at that point, do an assurance, which I'm going to explain next. So option two is the assurance, which is I'm not compliant, but I'm going to use 5% of covered funds, which in this case is 4.75% of the STOP award, to come into compliance. And so sign that assurance, and then you'll have to figure out how you're going to use the stop money to come into compliance. And then option 3 would be, we're not compliant and we don't care, take your money, in which case you would lose the 4.75% of the stop award, and it would ultimately be redistributed, I think. But your award would be reduced by that amount. So we've developed a form, which is not final yet. It's still in the review and approval process. But we will have it by the time we start processing your awards, or at least that's the plan. And so the form is an Excel spreadsheet that will let you select which of those 3 options, compliant, not compliant, but using the money, not compliant, and don't care. And then it lets you select your state. It will be pre-programmed with your state's allocation amount for the year. And so then it will let you calculate the penalty amount. So if you're in the category 3, forget about it, then it takes it equally off of victim services, law enforcement, prosecution, discretionary, basically everything but courts. If you're in option 2, we are going to use the money to come into compliance. Then it'll calculate for you. It'll tell you, here's your state award, here's your different allocation amounts, here's your PREA reallocation amount, and then it lets you assign it to what allocation you want to put it in. So you could put it all in discretionary if you want. You could put it in each of them. What it depends on is what your activities are. So, for example, if one of the areas where you're not in compliance with PREA is that you need to offer forensic exams for victims in correctional facilities, then you would you could take it from discretionary, prosecution, law enforcement, because those are the allocations, if you look in the FAQ, that forensic exams can come from. If you were doing training for investigators of sexual assault in prison, it would be law enforcement or discretionary. So that's kind of how that plays out. And so this form would allow you to tell us what allocations you're going to take it from. It also shows you the administrative funds from each category and lets you decide, am I going to take 10% from all the categories or whatever, so you'll see how much money is left in each category after taking out admin and taking out this PREA reallocation. The thing to note, though, is if you're taking the penalty, not going to come into compliance, don't care, you lose the money. Your award amount is reduced. If you're choosing the reallocation option, I'm going to use the funds to come into compliance, then the money is still in your stop award. So if you take it out of law enforcement, for some law enforcement purpose, then it counts towards your law enforcement money. And it would also count towards your sexual assault set-aside, I might add. So it's part of your stop award, just like the sexual assault set-aside money is and all your other sub-awards. It's just that similar to the sexual assault set-aside, and I know there's questions about that, and I'm going to get to it, you have to meet that allocation amount, but it's also within the allocations and purpose areas and everything else of the statute. So then I'll mention question 5 on this FAQ. What facilities does it apply to? So am I certifying that my whole state is compliant? No. It's just the facilities that fall under the operational control of the state executive branch, including facilities operated by private entities on behalf of the state executive branch. And there are provisions about contracting. So if you have private facilities that are contracted, they're covered. And so basically it's your state prisons for the most part. And in some states, there's like a State Department of Juvenile Justice, and so there's some state-controlled juvenile facilities. Those would be covered. Your local jails are probably not covered except to the extent that they have contracts with the state prisons, and then they fall under the contracting requirements. So just checking the questions that folks had ahead of time to make sure I answered them. Oh, is the 5% before or after administrative costs? It is before. It's off the top. The 4.75 technically now, not 5. But so whatever your stop amount is, then you take 4.75% of that, and that's your PREA amount. And then your admin, you would take 10% of each of the allocations. So if you're in the penalty phase, then the admin would be reduced because the allocations are all reduced. If you're in the reallocation, I'm going to use it to come into compliance, the PREA amount would be determined by taking 4.75% of your whole award, but then you can still take 5 or 10% of each allocation in calculating your admin. It's just you have some dollar amount that's your reallocation amount, and you have to make sure to use that for PREA purposes. But that still counts towards your allocations. Like I said, it's still just a piece of the overall pattern of your stop award. Hopefully that makes sense. But the form will walk you through that and do the math for you, which I think will be helpful. Do you need to submit the PREA certification with the application? This is covered in the letter from the governor, letter to the governor, which you hopefully got. But there's a single point of certification at OJP. And so the governor will submit a single certification to the OJP PREA office. And the due date is May the 15th. And then that office will redistribute it to all of the relevant grant programs. And what's the effect of PREA on the implementation plan? I think it would be helpful if you can address in the plan, we plan to do these activities related to PREA or something like that, just so we see it. But then this form also gives you space to spell out, here's the specific activities we're doing with stop funds, because we will need to monitor whether or not you're really spending that money for PREA purposes, whether your activities are in line with PREA purposes, whether you're in fact spending the money for those activities, things like that. And so that's part of the reason for this form, is so we'll be able to see, here's what you're doing, here's your amount of money, and we'll have a record of that. So I think that covers the PREA. Yeah.
So we, excuse me, we received 2 questions. One is from Kansas, and she indicates our circumstances will likely not fit exactly within one of the 3 options that Marnie is discussing. Kansas is not yet in compliance. However, the Kansas Department of Corrections has stated that Kansas should be compliant by January 2015 without the use of the 4.75 funds. Therefore, would our funding still be reduced?
So the only way, there's a possibility, but it's very, very limited. It's something that we've been calling the impossibility exception. So if there's nothing legally permissible, so if the only thing that you're out of compliance on is something that's legally impermissible with stop funds, which is construction. So there is one of the PREA provisions is what we call the youthful offender provision, and it requires that youthful offenders, which is defined, have to be sight and sound separated from adults. And so we've heard from some states, well, in order to get our youthful offenders sight and sound separated, we're going to have to build a new wing on our prison. That's the only way to do it. And you can't do that construction with stop funds. And so if that's the only thing that you need to come into compliance, then there's an option on the forms for you to say that, and then you would not be penalized from the stop funding. And the parallel circumstances that there's OJGDP, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention funding that's among the affected programs, and that funding can only be used for juvenile facilities. And so if you were in the situation of, well, our juvenile facilities are completely compliant now, but we still have work to do on our adult facilities, and we can't use the JJ money for adult facilities, then there's a box you can check that says that we only need to work on our adult facilities, and then your JJ money would not be impacted. But that's the only limited circumstance. So if that's not your circumstance, you should call me, because I definitely see the problem where if you've already got, so you've got, here's the 6 things we need to do to come into compliance. We have a plan in place to do that by January, and we already have the money set aside to do it. Then you're going to run into supplanting issues if you try to use stop money to do it. So talk to me directly about that, and I'll try to get answers, but I would not be that hopeful about how it will come out.
Okay, Marty, we have several people that have indicated they haven't received a copy of the letter that was sent out to the governors, and is it possible for them to get a copy?
Yes, I have it. I will send it to Michelle, and then she can send it out.
Okay, so we had several people that had that question, but let me make sure. We have not received the letter. We have not received the letter. We had another question from Massachusetts, Candace. If we are not in compliance with PREA and we opt to use the funds towards coming into PREA compliance, what is the expectation for any funds that are reverted at the end of the project period? Do we continue to track these funds separately and continue to use these funds to fund programs which will help to come into compliance? Do you understand the question?
I do understand the question. I'm just writing it down. I'm going to need to follow up on that one. I suspect that you would need to, as long as you're not compliant with PREA yet, I suspect that you would need to still use it. On the other hand, you allocated it. It's not your fault that you got it back. And we need to be consistent on this kind of thing with OJP because their programs are going to have the same issue. So I'm going to follow up with others in the department on that one and try to get an answer. But I'm sorry, I can't answer right now, and I do think that's a very good question. Okay, anything else?
Well, let me make sure. So Mary Marada she was one of the states that asked, Florida was one of the states that asked, that indicated they had not received a copy of the letter. But she also asked whose responsibility is it to submit the governor's letter by May 15th, and it's the responsibility of the governor. They will sign that certification or assurance and send it back to the PREA office, which is located in BJA, and then that office will distribute all the responses to the program offices that are impacted by PREA. So they would send, a copy to us so that we would know whether you all were in compliance or chose to use the money to come into compliance with PREA or choose to lose the money.
Great. Okay. Is that it?
Yes. To Jason, we have not distributed the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is still under review, the spreadsheet that Marnie talked about that will help folks with PREA and administrative costs and all that. We have not distributed that yet.
Okay. So I'm going to turn to now the bigger FAQ that we just released, which updates our previous FAQs for VAWA 2013. So we added a lot of new VAWA 2013 related questions, and we updated the questions we had where they were not consistent with VAWA 2013. You'll see it now has a nice table of contents, so you can just see what questions are there and go straight to the question that you're interested in. So what I'm going to do, as I said, is try to just do like the highlights. So please take the time to read through it. If you have any follow-up questions, you can email your grant manager. You can email me. But hopefully this is helpful and makes sense. I try to include all the questions that over time, like at the implementation plan calls and on the previous calls we've had on VAWA 2013, I've made notes of all the questions people have been asking, and I try to include them all in here. So hopefully this should answer the questions that have been floating around. So the first one that I wanted to highlight is number 2 on page 1, can stop fund support services for men. And if you'll remember what we've said in the past is that the project has to focus on women, but that because of civil rights laws, you would be required to serve similarly situated men in need. And this has had a couple of changes. One is that there's now 2 purpose areas that actually include men explicitly. And so under those 2 purpose areas, you could fund a men's program. And so one is the one we've already talked about, purpose area 17, about correctional detention, which is good because it means you could do a men's prison, not just women's prisons. And the other one is purpose area 19, which is services and responses targeting male and female victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, whose ability to access traditional services and responses is affected by their sexual orientation or gender identity. So, for example, you could fund a program specifically for battered gay men. The second thing that's changed, which is not as significant, is that we now have a civil rights provision. And I cannot answer a lot of questions about that provision, unfortunately, because there's a separate FAQ that's being developed on that, and that FAQ is still under review. Although we're hoping it'll get finalized soon. But that new provision does include sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity as prohibited grounds that you can't discriminate on. And it also has some language that says if sex segregation or sex-specific programming is necessary to the essential operation of a program, nothing in this paragraph shall prevent such program or activity from consideration of an individual's sex. In such circumstances, grantees may meet the requirements of this paragraph, meaning the civil rights provision, by providing comparable services to individuals who cannot be provided with the sex-segregated or sex-specific programming. So what, I can't give you a lot of detail again because it's still under review, but the sort of short form of that I can say is it's not enough to just say we're a domestic violence program, we don't serve men. Because this is a little bit higher standard. It has to be necessary to the essential operation of a program to have sex-specific. Now, it might be, our shelter only has 1 bedroom, and therefore we can't have both men and women in our shelter, so we provide hotel vouchers for men or something like that. But it does have to be a specific reason why it's necessary. So then the next one I'm going to talk about very briefly, number 4 on page 2, can stop funds be used to provide services to incarcerated victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Yes, there's now a purpose area for that. Question 5, can stop subgrantees provide services to lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, also known as LGBT, victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking with stop funds? And yes, there's now a purpose area for developing, enlarging, and strengthening programs and projects to provide services and responses targeting male and female victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, whose ability to access traditional services and responses is affected by their sexual orientation and gender identity. And then here again we have a reminder about the non-discrimination condition. So next, I start with types of services, question 1 on page 3. Can legal services be supported with stop funds? And if you remember in the past, there were those very specific limitations. It had to be linked to the victim's safety. But now, under the revised stop statute, there's a purpose area. The victim services purpose area explicitly includes legal assistance. So you can fund the full range of legal assistance for victims. Divorces, employment cases, public benefits, the whole thing. But there's a certification requirement. So if you're funding legal assistance, then your subgrantees will need to certify that they're meeting these requirements. And the requirements are listed out on this page of the FAQ. And it's in the stop solicitation, I believe there's a link to it. I think we're asking that you guys certify that you will make sure that people providing legal assistance will certify. So we'll get the certification from you, and then you will get the certification from your subgrantees, and you'll maintain that in your files. So then we turn the page and we jump to question 6 on page 4, the prevention question. So first, can stop funds support prevention programs? And the answer is now yes, because there's now a purpose area for that. But the purpose area has a limit of 5% of the state's total stop award. So again, whatever your amount is, off the top, you take 5%. And that's how much you can spend on prevention. This would be from the discretionary allocation only. And so then people are asking, okay, well, how do we tell the difference between prevention, which is under the 5% limitation, and outreach, which is still more broadly allowable? And so the answer is that the goal of prevention is to stop or reduce these crimes. By contrast, an outreach initiative is linked to a specific set of services, and the goal is to increase awareness about the services so that victims know where to go for those services. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of figuring out, is this prevention, is it outreach? If you have a question, you can always email your grant manager, and they will probably pass it on to me. But you can say, okay, I've got a subgrantee that wants to do this. Is it outreach or prevention? And so similarly, can programs in schools be supported with STOP funds? And yes, they can, to the extent that they fit within a purpose area. So that's what we said before. We provided this example about support groups meeting in school. That would be a victim service. But now you could also do prevention initiatives in school, and implementing prevention curricula in school, but it would have to be under that 5%. This next one, question 9 on page 5, is also a significant change in some ways. When can STOP funds be used to assist child sexual abuse victims? And in the past, I think we said something like only youth and adults. Well, it's still only youth and adults, but youth is now defined as 11 to 24. So you can serve sexual assault victims that are age 11 or older. There's a definition of sexual assault. I have it in the FAQs here. So that's the change. It's now 11 to 24. And so similarly, the question was in here before, can STOP funds address child sexual abuse when the victim is now an adult? And the answer is yes, if the abuse occurred or continued when the victim was 11 or older. So if she was over 11 when the abuse started, you've got no problem because you're treating abuse of somebody who's 11 or older. If her uncle started abusing her when she was 5, but it kept going until she was 15, then you can address that because she was 11 during the occurrence of the assault. So then I'm going to jump to page 6, question 14, can a state provide funding to a child advocacy center? This has come up more under staff than STOP, but we thought it would be useful to put it in here just in case, particularly since some of you administer both programs. So yes, it's allowable, but it's that age cutoff you have to keep in mind, 11 and up. And so you have to make sure that the STOP funds are only being used to address 11 and older. And that, so the victim who comes in that's 5 is served out of some other pot of money. And you'll also need to think about what allocation to use depending on what the purpose is of the subgrant. Because it's not necessarily victim services. A lot of what child advocacy centers do is investigation, and so maybe it's law enforcement, maybe discretionary. So that moves us to the next category of questions. So I'll take a quick pause and ask if any questions have come in on what we've covered so far.
Okay, we had a question from Kitty in Wisconsin. Can legal assistance include immigration issues?
Yes, it can.
I think that's the only questions that have come in for the sections that you've covered thus far.
Okay, so then I will move to financial questions. And I may not have anything I need to talk about in that one. I don't. So we jump to match, which starts on page 11. And there has been a significant change in the match. And I'm sorry, it's a little confusing. It's one of these things where we had to get very analytical about the specific words that were used in 2 different parts of the statute. So there's 2 different provisions that impact your match. One is in the overarching definitions and grant conditions, and that part has not changed. So that's the part that says no matching funds shall be required for a grant or subgrant for a tribe, territory, or victim service provider or any other entity, including a state that petitions for a waiver. So you can still petition for waiver based on hardship, and there's an FAQ that's, I don't think has changed, but it describes what information. Question 13 on page 14 describes what information to provide in your waiver request. And it still has a language, no matching funds can be required for victim service providers or tribes. Here's the tricky part. The match provision within the STOP statute was amended, and so the old language said federal share of a grant may not exceed 75% of the total cost of the project described in the application submitted, period. The new language says, except that for purposes of this subsection, the cost of projects for victim services or tribes for which there's an exemption under the general definitions and grant conditions shall not count towards the total cost of the project. So the easiest way to understand this is the chart on page 12. And this chart has 3 different categories. So there's first the category where match is waived for the subgrantee, but not exempted for the state. So the state can't require the subgrantee to match, but the state still has to meet it somehow at their level. Column 2 is where it's both waived for the subgrantee and exempted for the state. So you can't pass it on to the subgrantee in that case, but you can also subtract it from your total award amount when you calculate your match. So you're not having to match it either. And then the third category is it's neither waived or exempted. So you can require them to provide match, and you are required to provide it. And then you could apply for a waiver on any of the ones that are your keys. So if you look, if it's to a victim service provider, but not for victim services, so for example, you're funding a rape crisis center to provide training for law enforcement. Under the law enforcement allocation, that is a subgrant that's to a victim service provider. It's a rape crisis center, but it's not for victim services. And so it is, you can't push it onto the rape crisis center and tell them to match or require them to match, but you still have to match that amount. If you're funding the rape crisis center to provide hospital advocacy for sexual assault victims, that is a subgrant that is to a victim service provider and for victim services, and therefore not only can you not pass it on to the rape crisis center, but you also don't have to pay it. So if that was a subgrant for $100,000, to the rape crisis center for providing hospital advocacy, and your stop award was $600, you would only be matching $500 and not $6, because you subtract the $100,000 because it's to a victim service provider for victim services. And the other thing in that category is tribe. So if you're subgranting to a tribe, for them to enhance their law enforcement or for them to provide rape crisis services, whatever, then it's in that category where it's both exempted to you and you can't pass it on. And then the last thing is, awards to all those other entities, then there's no waiver or exemption. So you can pass it on to them, and it's required of you. Hopefully that makes sense. Question 5 has not changed. Can you request the exempt victim service providers to voluntarily provide the match? And yes, that's still allowable, but it better be really voluntary. If they come to us and say, hey, they're telling us we can't get subgrants unless we provide a match, we're going to probably have a problem with that. But I know in some cases there are victim service providers that get a lot of donations or a lot of volunteer time, and they are willing and happy to provide match, and in that case, that's totally fine. So I think that's it for match. So why don't we pause and see have any questions come in.
No, Marnie.
Good. Okay, so then the next category or section is allocation issues, which starts on page 15. So the first thing is if a state does not receive enough fundable projects in a particular allocation to meet the set-aside for that category, can they reallocate those funds? So this is one of the new things in VAWA 2013. It used to be, you just have to give back the money if you couldn't get any court projects funded, for example. We've seen that happen. But now there's an out. If you legitimately can't get enough applicants in a particular category, then you can reallocate it to a different category. I'll tell you, this may sound like a lot, but our purpose across this FAQ was to both keep in mind, not overburdening the state, keeping things sort of streamlined and as simple as possible, but at the same time preventing abuses. Because, we need to legitimately make sure that it's not just a state. And not that I'm saying that any of you are going to do this, but just that it's our duty as a federal fiduciary to make sure it doesn't happen, that where a state could just say, we have a problem with court money, we never get any court applicants, we're going to redistribute this. But, with the court example, are you guys still there? I dropped my phone.
I'm still here.
Oh, thank goodness. Okay. I'll try to be more careful. So with the court allocations, for example, we would want to see some things about how to do outreach to courts, who from courts was on your planning committee. Did you get any applications? If you got some applications but you just determined they were unqualified, what was the reason for that? Were they out of scope? Did they have significant activities that compromised victim safety? What was the thinking? What was your selection process like? Was it an open process, competitive, or was it some kind of a sole source? And then relevant state organizations. So as I said, if it's courts, and you have the state court administrator saying, we just can't use this money, then that's going to help us feel like, okay, they're working with the right people, they've done a really good job of distributing their solicitation, trying to get it out there, and they're just not getting the applications, they can redistribute that money. I'll tell you, we hear a lot from state court administrators that they're having a hard time collaborating with states on this program. And so in part that's why I use that example, in part because it's now 2 courts, which might make it more difficult. So that's why we would want to hear from somebody like the state court administrator, the state attorney general, or the state district attorneys association, if it's prosecution money, somebody that would feel that would accurately know about their constituency and whether there's some good reason why they're not applying for that money, and that would have the ability to say, yeah, we're comfortable with this, we can't use the money or whatever, so that we know it's really gotten out there. And I know that the culturally specific money, particularly this year, is going to be challenging because of the new, more limited definition. So we're proposing that there's also some technical assistance providers that you can reach out to that may be able to help you identify those communities in your states, provide outreach to communities in your states, things like that. And so it's not required up front that you provide us with these things, so it's not like you need to do a GAN and attach all these things. It's just that if we do a site visit, we're going to ask, or desk review we might ask. And so we would encourage you to reach out to your grant manager just to say, like, hey, we couldn't get any court applications. We're thinking of reallocating this money. Here's all the steps we've taken. Does that sound good? And sort of give yourself some cover. So then question 2, what if the state allocates the money to a subgrantee but gets it back? again, this is now explicitly in VAWA 2013. If it's returned, you can reallocate it. So you gave out your court money, and then they didn't spend it, and so you closed it out, you got it back. Now you can do it for victim services because you got it back. But keep in mind your award end date and whether or not you're going to need a no-cost extension to have time to do that reallocation. And then there's information in that question about no-cost extensions. So then I'm going to skip a question and go to number 4 on page 16. What types of entity are eligible for the 13% for victim services? This is an interesting change in VAWA 2013 because victim services and victim service provider now have their own definitions. They used to be a single definition that was really talking about the organization and not the services, but there's now a separate definition for services that describes the kinds of services, hotlines, legal advocacy, economic advocacy, shelter, and so forth. And the 30% allocation in the statute uses the word victim services, not victim service provider. So this is part of why that funkiness with the match comes up. It's covered under the 30% victim services if it's providing victim services, even if it's not a defined victim service provider. So then I'm going to go to question 7, which I sort of talked about already. What allocation should be used for the prevention purpose area? It has to come from discretionary. Question 8 on page 17, what entities can receive funds under the court's allocation? Because the court allocation is now 2 courts rather than 4 courts, it has to go to a court entity. It could be state, local, tribal, or juvenile courts. And there is a definition of court in the statute that is quoted here. So examples would include something like a state administrative office of the court, state supreme court, local domestic violence court, local probation project, if probation is part of the courts in your state. But we really encourage you to have the state court administrators on your planning committee because they can advise on what the needs of the courts are, what is required for courts in order to accept money, those kinds of things. So related question, can a court receive the money but then pass it through to a victim service provider? And that's fine as long as it's actually awarded to a court, then the court can subcontract it to another entity for all or part of the project. Question 10, what types of agencies can receive funds under the 10% set aside within victim services for culturally specific community-based organizations? So it has to meet the definition of a community-based organization, which is focused primarily on the 4 crimes, has an established culturally specific program, has a primary focus on underserved populations, or obtains expertise or shows demonstrated capacity to work effectively on domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And then 2 more things. It has to be primarily, this comes from the definition of culturally specific, primarily directed towards racial and ethnic minority groups and providing services tailored to the unique needs of the specific population. And you'll remember the definition of racial and ethnic minorities. The definition of culturally specific has changed, so it's only racial and ethnic minorities. That's where that E comes from, primarily directed to racial and ethnic minorities. And racial and ethnic minorities, this is question 12 on 18, is American Indians, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders, Blacks, and Hispanics. And so it has to be targeting those racial and ethnic groups. So if in the past you were funding deaf organizations, rural organizations, LGBT groups, other types of underserved populations with culturally specific needs, those would no longer fit in the culturally specific set-aside. It would still be under the requirement to address in your implementation plan how you will recognize and meaningfully respond to the needs of underserved populations, but it's not specifically included in the set-aside anymore. And that part I just said about underserved, other underserved is question 13 on page 18. So the primary mission needs to be addressing needs of racial and ethnic minority groups, or it has to at least have a special expertise regarding a particular racial and ethnic minority group. So you can't just fund your YWCA that claims we have 50% Hispanic in our service area, therefore we're providing culturally specific, therefore we can serve this set aside. They'd have to demonstrate to you that they have a special expertise, that they have staff trainings, that they have relationships with the Hispanic community that helps with cross-training or providing volunteers to show they really have a culturally specific program, not that it's just like, yeah, this is our service population, so we serve them. Hopefully that makes sense. Oh, and one of the questions we got ahead of time was for examples of culturally specific programs under the new definition. And so I reached out to our program managers that administer the culturally specific grant programs that we have, because we also have a program called CLASS, which is culturally and linguistically specific services, and we have SAS Cultural, which is sexual assault culturally specific services. And this new definition applies to them as well. So they provided me with some examples of their grants that meet the new definition. So one example is actually in Chicago, Korean American Women in Need, and it's an organization established solely to address violence against women and children in the Korean American community. And so their grant is strengthening their support systems for Chicago's Asian American victims of sexual assault and provide outreach into the Asian immigrant community about the availability of the services. Then we have another example that's called Mujeres Unidas y Activas, which is a community-based organization by and for monolingual Latina immigrants in the San Francisco area. And so they're going to have a Spanish language sexual assault crisis line and provide culturally specific crisis intervention for victims of sexual assault. Tribal counts. So tribal, you can award this to tribal governments for culturally specific services or tribal organizations. So this example is a group called Tiwa Women United. That's a Native nonprofit organization and provides sexual assault services in the 8 northern pueblos area of New Mexico. And they're using this money to provide culturally specific advocacy and crisis intervention services to Native American victims of sexual assault. Then the next example we have is called Breaking Free, which is in Minnesota, and it's an organization that helps sex trafficked and sexually assaulted women and girls. And they have specifically focused culturally on African Americans since 1996. So they have this focus on sexual assault, but they also have this background and expertise and experience specifically on African American victims. And so this grant is going to provide help for sexual assault victims that are sex trafficked. So hopefully those examples will give you some ideas. So then I'm going to turn to question 11 on page 18. What types of subgrant entities are required to have 501c3 status? I know we've gotten a lot of questions about this one. So any entity, this is the VAWA language, that is eligible for funding based on its status as a nonprofit organization must be a 501c3. So then the trick is which entities under STOP are eligible for funding based on status as a nonprofit. And really it comes down to the culturally specific community-based organizations, because the definition of a community-based organization is a nonprofit organization. And so, or there's one option that's tribal governmental organization. So if you're funding tribal government with your culturally specific, they don't have to be a 501c3. But anything other than a tribal government, then the culturally specific organizations would need to have a 501c3. But the other area where this comes up is the match waiver, because if you remember, victim service providers are exempt from match. And so if an organization, even though the victim services set-aside is now services, not organizations, so people that apply for victim services money are not getting their eligibility based on their status as a nonprofit, because a governmental organization could apply if they're doing victim services under that definition. But in order to have that exemption from match, both for you to exempt the organization and say that you're not required to put match on them, but also for you to subtract it from your award amount, it has to be a victim service provider. And the victim service provider, in most cases, has to be a nonprofit. There's two exceptions. There's governmental rape crisis centers not in territories, and tribal governmental organizations. So if they're a victim service provider that's a tribal governmental organization or a governmental rape crisis center not in a territory, because in territories, governmental rape crisis centers are not defined as victims. They don't meet the definition of victim service provider. But except for those two, you'll still need the 501c3 from victim service providers because of the match. So 12 and 13 I talked about already. 14 on 19 is another one where we've gotten a lot of questions. How do we calculate the sexual assault set-aside? And so I think this is helpful, and I gave an example with dollars in it because this is how the PREA reallocation also works. So you take your amount that's at the top, you get $600,000 from us, say. Then you take 20% of $600,000, which I think is $120, but math is not my thing. Doesn't sound right. Oh, yeah, it does. Yeah, I think that is right. So that would be your amount. So the example I have here is if the state gets $100,000, then your set-aside is $20,000. And the set-aside has to be in 2 or more allocations, but that's not including discretionary. So it has to be in victim services, courts, law enforcement, and prosecution, 2 out of those. So give it the example I have here. You've got $100,000, so your sexual assault set-aside is $20,000. Your victim services is $30,000, courts is $5,000, prosecution and law enforcement are each $25,000. So then the $20,000 for sexual assault is not in addition to these allocations, it fits within them. So if you use $10,000 of victim services money for sexual assault, then you'd have $10,000 left for other projects in victim services, and you'd need an additional $10,000 from at least one of courts, law enforcement, and or prosecution. Even if you spent all $20,000 of the victim services, or $20,000 out of the $30,000 of the victim service on sexual assault, so it's like, hey, I met it, I spent $20,000, but it's only in one allocation. If you spent it only on victim services, you'd still need to put some sexual assault funding in law enforcement, courts, or prosecution in order to meet the set-aside. And if it's discretionary, so for example, the prevention money, so it can't fit within victim services, courts, law enforcement, or prosecution, it doesn't count towards the set-aside. It has to be those allocations. So I know this is confusing. Hopefully that helped. And I'll take a pause now because I'm done with that allocation category of questions, and Michelle can tell me if any questions have come in.
Okay, we have a lot of questions, Marnie. So one is from Pearl Gibson, and it's on the sexual assault set-aside. 20% of award for the SA set-aside will equate to more than 20% across the 4 service areas. Since the 20% is on the entire state award, they can only be distributed across law enforcement, prosecution, victim services, or courts. It seems we will need those areas to cover more in order to meet the required amount.
Okay. I know this is really confusing and it's hard to understand, so I'm trying to think of how to make it clear. So 20% is the sexual assault set-aside. It doesn't reduce those allocations, so it's not like you have to take, first of all, it's not like you have to take 20% across all 4 allocations. It's just that tells you the dollar amount. And then that dollar amount has to be in at least 2 allocations. But it's not like you're reducing your victim services allocation, for example, if you took half of it from victim services, other than to the extent that if your victim services money in the past was 100% domestic violence, then those domestic violence organizations are going to have less money available because some of it is going to have to go to sexual assault. But it's like almost you have 2 different equations and 2 different charts. So one chart would show you here's my total amount and here's my amount in each allocation. So you'd have 30% victim services and so forth, and you'd have those dollar amounts. Then you go back to the top, and you take 20% from that top amount, and there's your sexual assault amount. And then you assign it to allocation. So it's just like, I have 5 subgrants in victim services. 2 of those are sexual assault, 3 of those are domestic violence or whatever. And so those 2 sexual assault ones count towards the set aside. But in terms of how you add up your allocations, how you look at the allocations, it's the same. It's just that separately, you've got this dollar amount, and you need to look at your subgrants across the allocations and make sure that you have that much money going to sexual assault and that it covers at least 2 allocations. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, we had a question on match. If we use all of our discretionary funds to victim service providers in a non-competitive process, would the state be exempt under that allocation with match requirement?
It would depend. That's a good question. If the purpose of the subgrant, and I know there are a lot of states that do this, so if you're giving all your discretionary money to victim service providers for victim services, so it's going to rape crisis centers to provide hospital advocacy and domestic violence programs to provide shelter for victims and, all the things that fit, hotlines, advocacy, all the things that fit under that definition of services, then yes, you can subtract that from your award amount and not match it.
Here's a question that asks, can STOP cover direct mental health services?
That is a good question. I would say it depends. So it would need to be domestic violence or sexual assault specific mental health services. So like, helping victims with PTSD specifically for victims. And I would also say, because this is consistent with our other grant programs, even though I don't believe it is in this FAQ, something to note for the future. Long-term counseling, not so much, but short-term counseling, yes. I know I don't have a definition for short or long-term.
Okay. And I just wanted to add, we had a question that came in when you were talking about the whole ability to reallocate funds when they got funds back. That only applies to 2014 awards forward. You wouldn't be able to just reallocate if you got funds back from a subgrantee in fiscal year 2013. You would have to still follow the previous guidance that had been provided. Correct, Marnie?
That is correct. And I should add, this is should be in the front of this FAQ, but just a note to keep in mind, the old FAQ is still on the website because this FAQ is only for FY14 and forward because that's when the VAWA 2013 changes take effect. If you have an issue with an FY13 grant, then you should refer to the old FAQ, which is still on the website for that reason.
Here's a question about tribal match. If we fund a tribal law enforcement agency under the law enforcement allocation, they are not required to match, and we are not required to match that amount either, meaning we, the state.
Correct, because it's to a tribe.
Here's another one. We have a follow-up question with regard to the funds that are supposed to go to courts. We have an open solicitation process, but do not get many applications from our courts. If we do get applications from courts but don't feel the project is a viable one, is that enough to not fund that project and reallocate the money to a different category?
Right. It is. We would just want you to document in some way why is it not viable. Like this court doesn't have the capacity for what they're taking on. It's really out of scope of the program because they're talking about, forced labor trafficking and not about sexual assault or whatever. Document that so that if we audit you, we'll be able to see, like, yeah, that's legitimate. You didn't get any applications that were viable.
Can a prosecution unit provide victim services as a victim witness? Isn't there something about confidentiality in the victim service definition? This is from Kitty.
That is a very good question. Right. So there's two different definitions to reference in that case. And give me a second because I'm turning to it in my statute. So victim services is defined as services provided to victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking, including telephonic or web-based hotlines, legal advocacy, economic advocacy, emergency and transitional shelter, accompaniment and advocacy through medical, civil, or criminal justice, immigration, and social support systems, crisis intervention, short-term individual and group support services, see there's that short-term, information and referrals, culturally specific services, population-specific services, and other related supportive services. The second definition to turn to is victim assistant. A victim assistant is a person, whether paid or serving as a volunteer, who provides services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, or dating violence under the auspices or supervision of a court, law enforcement, or prosecution agency. So that's the distinction. The victim witness person in the prosecutor's office is a victim assistant, and so that's the sort of category. It's confusing because the way these definitions are, but they're providing victim assistance, not victim services. And that's the distinction. But if you had a governmental, I'll give you the example of where this came up, and this is actually addressed in a different way now. Alexandria, Virginia, where I used to live, has a rape crisis center and a domestic violence program. Actually, the domestic violence piece is not addressed. That's run by the Alexandria Office on Women. They provide the same, and that's a governmental office. It's an office of the city government. They provide the same level of confidentiality, the same type and quality of services as a rape crisis center, but it's actually nice. The government of Alexandria is stepping up and providing these services. So those are covered now in two ways. The rape crisis services are covered because the definition of a victim service provider now includes rape crisis centers, and then you have to turn to the definition of rape crisis center, and a rape crisis center is a nonprofit, non-governmental, or tribal organization or governmental entity, except not in a territory, that provides intervention and related assistance, etc. It has to not be part of the criminal justice system and offer the same level of confidentiality as a nonprofit that provides similar services. So your rape crisis center is now a victim service provider, except in territory. But you have a governmental domestic violence shelter. Not part of the police department, still offers confidentiality. You can now fund that as victim services.
Okay,
any other
more questions, or because we got a lot of questions in the queue?
Yeah, I'll take a few more questions. I don't have, well, yeah, there's a decent number of questions. There's a decent amount of stuff in the FAQs, so maybe two more questions, and then I'll...
Okay. What is the difference between culture-specific populations and population-specific organizations?
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm writing down, and then I'm going to have to let that go back to my statute again. So culturally specific, we've talked about, is those specific racial and ethnic populations. So culturally specific in the statute, culturally specific services is community-based services that include culturally relevant and linguistically specific services and resources to culturally specific communities. Culturally specific is defined as those specific racial and ethnic minorities. And then you also have to look at the definition of a community-based organization, which is the one I went over earlier, focuses primarily on domestic violence, blah, 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 established culturally specific program, primary focus on underserved populations, or obtains expertise and shows demonstrated capacity. Population specific is broader. population-specific organization is a nonprofit, non-governmental organization that primarily serves members of a specific underserved population and has demonstrated expertise and experience providing targeted services to members of that specific underserved population. So again, if it's a YWCA that happens to be in East LA, where the majority of people they're going to see are Hispanic, that's not by definition culturally specific or population specific. But if it's a deaf organization, that's a population specific organization because their focus is on serving deaf people, and they would have the specific expertise and experience serving deaf people. Now, population-specific services is then victim-centered services that address safety, health, economic, legal, housing, workplace, etc., needs of victims of the 4 crimes, and are designed primarily for and targeted to a specific underserved population. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, Barney, this will be the last one, and we got a couple of questions on this. It has to do with calculating the making sure they meet the sexual assault set aside, but if they have projects that, are dual projects. So this one came in. If a law enforcement agency or prosecution agency receives a STOP grant to address domestic violence and sexual assault, how would I calculate the sexual assault set aside? Many of our agencies address both.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead to that. That's a good segue because that's in the next section of questions, and I'll just jump to that question and then I'll go back. So that's starts on page 22, question 9, what is the new sexual assault set-aside requirement? I just went over that, so I'm not going to go over it again. But then what is the compliance deadline for the new sexual assault set-aside? March 7, 2015, so that'll be fiscal 15. Which means that for this year, you just need to tell us, here's how we're working on it, here's how we're thinking about it. That's what we're going to look for in the implementation plan. Here's our progress. In your 15 implementation plan, we're going to look for the specifics of how you're actually going to meet it. Then question 11, how can states ensure that the projects funded under the set-aside meaningfully address sexual assault? First of all, we encourage you to work closely with your sexual assault coalitions and service providers in each state to ensure that the programs are really meaningful. So you might be able to, you're funding a dual program for dual services. That might be fine, and you might be able to say, you need to somehow assess the percentage. You might be able to say 50% of that is sexual assault, 50% is domestic violence, so I'm going to count 50% of it towards the set-aside. But you have to make sure it's meaningfully addressing sexual assault. What we've found in our programs with sexual assault is, particularly in the early years when we were learning more about how to do this, we'd see a lot of applicants where they were domestic violence organizations, their staff was all experienced and had expertise on domestic violence, their history was on domestic violence, in some cases even when they called themselves a dual organization, and they would just submit their application and write and sexual assault after everything. And you could tell by reading the application that they didn't have an understanding of sexual assault. They didn't have any services that were really tailored for sexual assault. They didn't have staff that was expert on sexual assault. And so those applicants we did not count towards the set-aside, or we do not now count towards the set-aside. So your coalitions and service providers can help you, and we've had coalitions provide us with this kind of input. With things like, what can you put in your solicitation that's going to encourage sexual assault organizations to come forward, that's going to encourage really meaningful sexual assault services, and they can also provide training for your staff and peer reviewers about how to read applications for meaningful sexual assault services. We also encourage you, and this is something we do, look at your progress reports, your subgrantee reports when they come in, and see to what extent are they actually addressing sexual assault. They have to say on victim served, they have to allocate percentages. And so you can say, well, this subgrantee said they were going to serve 50% domestic violence and 50% sexual assault. And then they get a progress report that says 95% are domestic violence and only 5% are sexual assault. Then you're going to want to rethink whether that subgrantee is really meaningfully addressing sexual assault. So now I will turn back to page we don't have anything on the grant management issue. So I'm going to turn to page 21, VAWA 2013 questions. So when did the changes take effect? They take effect with your 14th stop award. What purpose areas did VAWA 2013 add? I'm not going to read them, but they're listed here so you can see the new purpose areas. What changes were made to the rape exam certification? So I'm going to go through each certification and what changes were made and when you have to be compliant with the changes. So the first change in the rape exam payment is that you have to coordinate with healthcare providers in the region to notify victims of sexual assault of the availability of rape exams at no cost to the victim. Second, there used to be 3 different options of how to meet this. There was providing the exams free of cost was 1. 2 was arranging for victims to obtain the exams free of charge. And 3 was reimbursing the victim. And then there was a whole bunch of things you had to meet in terms of when and how if you were going to do the reimbursement. Well, they took that reimbursement option off the table. So victims cannot bear any out-of-pocket costs now, even if they're reimbursed. So if your state was having the victims pay up front and then reimbursing them, which I think was not very many states, it might be 1 or 2, if any, you're going to need to rethink how you do your forensic exam payment, because now it needs to be either you provide it free or you arrange for victims to obtain it free. I don't really understand the distinction, honestly, between those two, but the bottom line is, either you're going to provide money to like the same program or something like that to provide the exams, or the hospital or whoever does the exams is going to submit to a state fund or to the local law enforcement or whoever the payment is, so the victim's not ever getting a bill. So there's been a lot of confusion related to that piece. Can we still ask or require victims to submit the bill to their insurance? A lot of states still do that. And you can still ask or require victims to submit charges to their insurance. That is still permissible. However, you need to make sure, if you're doing that, that victims are not billed any costs for co-payments or deductibles, but rather that they're billed to whatever your government source is paying for the exams. So usually you go to the hospital for whatever purpose, you start getting a whole lot of bills. Even if in the end your insurance pays it, you still see all those bills, and the victim needs to not be getting those bills, so you have to work that out. And as always, we encourage states to not require insurance billing just because, if it's a child, their parent might get that explanation of benefits. If it's a spousal situation, the spouse might get the explanation of benefits. There could be insurance discrimination down the line, so it's preferred not to do that. And then back to the first thing I said, coordinating with healthcare providers to notify victims. What the heck does that mean? So every state is so different in terms of how their payment works and how their healthcare works that we couldn't really have a one-size-fits-all. We don't want to say this is what you have to do. It's going to depend on your state. But the point is to ensure the broadest possible notification of victims on where to go for forensic exam, how to get it paid for, those kinds of things. So we thought about it in terms of collaborating partners that would help you distribute the notice. So people like your state hospital association, state medical association, state nursing association, Indian Health Service if you have tribes in your jurisdiction, state insurance commission. So just think about what partners you can work with that will notify the broadest range of people. When do they need to? So when you need to be in compliance with these new changes, March 7th, 2016 is the deadline for forensic exams. Everyone is different. So the next issue is fees and costs. What changes were made to the fees and costs? See, this is the one where you have to make sure that certain fees around protection orders and domestic violence crimes are not billed to victims. This has been expanded. It now includes felony and misdemeanor, domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking offenses. It used to be just domestic violence. And it also includes fees in connection with modification, enforcement, dismissal, or withdrawal of a protection order, and includes protection orders to protect victims of dating violence. I'd be surprised if anyone was charging fees in criminal cases, although occasionally I've seen witness fees, and witness fees is one of the categories that's prohibited. So that might be something to look at or think about. Modification, enforcement, dismissal, or withdrawal is something we've always, as my colleague says, this is belt and suspenders. We've always interpreted the language to cover those things, but now it's explicit. So that one shouldn't be a problem. But then the other thing is the category protection orders, they left out dating violence when they enacted this and amended it earlier. So it was domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So if you had a separate dating violence order, or if you were charging fees for victims of dating violence, that's now going to need to stop. So then what's the timing for these amendments? It's the period ending on the date on which the next state legislature ends, and it starts October 1st, 2013, because that's the effective date on VAWA. So I'll walk you through this. So you start at October 1st, 2013, and then you look at what legislative session were you in. Is it a 1-year or 2-year session? You go until the end of that session. So if it's a 1-year session, your current session might have been your 2013 session. So then you have until the end of your 2014 session. If it's a 2-year session and 2013 was the first year, then you might have 2013, 2014. That's the current session. 2014, 2015 would be the next session, and you'd have until the end of that 14-15 session. So we talked about sexual assault already. Question 12, page 23, what changes did VAWA 2013 make to the implementation planning process? I'm not going to go through that because the implementation plan checklist on the website has it. You can read it at your leisure, but it is something we've spent time on before.
Let me just add one, Arnie. Somebody brought to my attention. So I just want to make sure that people understand that you should be following what the statutory requirements that are listed in the checklist. That is what your implementation plan should line up to. We just noticed in the solicitation one thing was omitted, and it had to do with, it should have been listed on page 19 under the information about the project goals and objectives for the domestic violence-related homicides, that we did not include the coordination with FIPSA, VOCA, and RPE, but that is on the checklist, so just make sure your plan lines up with what is being asked for in the checklist, and we will make an adjustment to the solicitation and repost it to make sure that information is in the solicitation.
Thanks, Michelle, and that's a good point, too. You should use that checklist and go through it, make sure you have all the things, because that's also what we're going to use when we review your implementation plan. We're going to match it up with that checklist and make sure that those statutory things are all in there. And it actually leads nicely into the next question. How should states coordinate their implementation plans with the plans for FIPSA and VOCA and rape prevention education? How will states document this coordination? So the purpose of this is to provide greater diversity of projects funded and leverage the efforts under the various funding streams. And this is another one. Every state's different in terms of how they administer these programs, how they structure their state government. So there's not a single way that we can say this is how to do it. We just want you to keep in mind, here's the goals. And so there's some different things we provided just as ideas you could think about. You're not limited to these ideas, but you could convene a meeting of the different program administrators and talk about, here's the different priorities, different plans. You could have a shared implementation process. We had some conversations with the FIPSA office, and you could, in fact, submit a joint FIPSA VAWA plan as long as it meets all the things on our checklist and all the things on their checklist. You could have the program administrators attend each other's implementation planning meetings. You can read and comment on each other's plans. You can just share the plan with the other administrators and get their feedback. So someone had asked me last week, what if I have the other administrators on my implementation planning committee? And that's perfect. You would just need to say that in your implementation plan. We coordinated our plan by having the administrators for these programs on the planning, and what was the impact of that? So you need to address that. They have suggestions about XYZ topics, or something about what the effect was. 14, what entities need to be on the planning committee. I think we've talked about that before. How will they provide documentation from the planning committee? This is not a new FAQ. This is the one that I've issued already, talked about already, so I'm not going to go through it. What does it mean to consult with tribes? Does it need to include all the tribes in states with significant numbers of tribes? The answer is you really do need to invite all the tribes to the table. It could mean that you send them all a document to comment. It could mean that you have a meeting or a conference call with them. But you really do want to make sure you give sufficient notice to them, keep records of who was invited, how they were invited, whether and how they participated. You may also have, like an intertribal council, some type of tribal consortia, and you may be able to work with them to facilitate. So it doesn't replace, like I talked to the consortia weighed in. That doesn't replace talking to the individual tribes, but they may be able to help you reach out to the individual tribes and help coordinate that. What does it mean to provide goals and objectives for domestic violence homicide in the implementation plan? So first, provide statistics on the rates of domestic violence homicide in your state. Whatever statistics are available. We know you might not have exactly that. Then when you do your consultation with law enforcement, prosecution, victim services, the people on your committee, ask them, do they think these statistics are accurate? What is the best way to address domestic violence homicide in the state? And so then you should have specific goals and objectives. And I think, I'm not sure if the toolkit is out yet, but when it is, they have some good examples of goals and objectives that should be helpful. So, for example, you should have some specific priority areas, projects, or technical assistance that you have that have a purpose of reducing domestic violence homicide. In the subsequent plans, so 15, 16, and so forth, include any changes to the statistics. So I'm going to try to, we're running out of time, I'm going to try to just go fast. We talked about the forensic exam certification already. We talked about health insurance. I highlighted this one, question 11 on 29, just as a reminder, are states permitted to require victims to cooperate with law enforcement as a condition for receiving a free exam? And so just a reminder, the exam and the payment for the exam have to be available regardless of whether the victim cooperates with law enforcement or participates in the criminal justice system. Human costs we've already gone over. So that is it. And we've got 5 minutes left, and I'm happy to just stay on and take more questions as long as people are still on.
Let me see. I may have a couple more that came in. Some I've been answering. Okay, so this one came in. This had to do with the waiver, and match waiver. With the clarification of match waiver for the discretionary category, is funding a victim services agency to provide victim services. Can you provide a revised table on page 12 of the FAQ to state that on its own row? This is from Tanya, Kentucky. What you say, Marnie?
I don't understand.
Yeah, me neither. This is from Tanya in Kentucky. I'll forward you the message.
Okay, that's fine. I can just talk to her directly.
Say again?
I'll talk to her directly.
Okay. Let me send that to you. Let's see. There's another question that came in, but you may want to respond directly to them. She had you CC'd. This one, you may have covered this, was from Mary Murata, and it has to do with if a state starts in a 2014 award in 2016, do we still have to be in compliance with the new policy changes, i.e. the new sexual assault set-aside that is stated to become effective March 7, 2015?
Yes.
Another question from Kitty. Is it no longer required for non-victim services applicants to consult with victim services providers in their area? And do we not need to document that consultation anymore?
You still do, but it's a little bit different. I'm getting it for you in the statute. because it used to be an application requirement and the timing on it was really wonky. And it's now an implementation plan requirement. And so it used to be you had to have the actual documentation of how the subgrantees were consulting, and it's like you haven't issued the grant awards yet. It's really weird. Now what's in the implementation plan is a description of how the state will ensure that subgrantees will consult with victim service providers during the course of developing their grant applications in order to ensure that they're designed to promote safety, confidentiality, and economic independence of victims. So in other words, this would just be in your implementation plan. You'd have a statement that says, we will ensure this by requiring MOUs or by requiring letters of support or whatever it is that you're going to do, but you don't have to have the actual letters anymore. It's just a description of how you're going to do it. The other thing to note, though, is you used to have those letters from prosecution, law enforcement, court, and victim services programs describing need for grant funds, intended use, expected results, and demographic characteristics. That is still there. It hasn't really changed, but it's now part of the implementation plan. So your implementation plan includes those letters from prosecution, law enforcement, courts, and victim service programs.
Okay, thanks. One other, I just wanted, this was just more, I wanted to make sure the group got this kind of FYI. It was from Pearl Gibson in Washington. She just noted that we had removed the actual allocations, the allocations for each category from the solicitation, and I sent her a message just explaining we lifted a lot of things from the solicitation if it showed up somewhere else. So, for instance, the allocation breakdown, the 25%, 25%, 30%, since that's listed in the certification that the authorized representative has to sign, we took that out of the solicitation. So it is part of the solicitation. It's just in the certification on page 27. And I think that's I don't have any other questions in the queue.
Great. Well, if anybody thinks of questions, feel free to email them.
And I forwarded you a couple that we received that were more specific to that administrator. So.
Okay.
Well, thanks, everybody. We certainly appreciate you taking time out to be on this call. We have another call that will happen on the 18th. You're more than welcome to join as many times as you like if you need to hear this information again. And we will certainly, if you think of questions after the fact, please be sure to email us and we will respond. So thanks, everybody, for being on the call. And thank you, Tanya, for getting us set up with the call and recording the call.
No problem.